Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Susan Eisenhower, Tim Miller, and Karl Rove, with your moderator, Van Gordon Sauter.
4849. Invoke my name.
Okay.
Put in a good word with the organizer. Tell him that the reason I was late getting on the stage.
They're keeping us about 5 feet apart. It's just...
Well, that's nice.
Oh!
Would you mind extending the cane so I can see how far I need to be away?
Are we set? Okay. Let me first of all express my appreciation for your turning out for this event on behalf of Susan and Tim and Karl. Deeply appreciated. We owe a special debt to Karl. This is his 23rd panel in 36 hours. I understand the best panel was at 1 a.m. in the parking lot of the supermarket across the street from the hotel.
And those of you who are in your jammies, I know who you are.
Let me say to the panel, when we run out of time here, I'd like each of you to name a book that you think would be most enlightening, helpful to anyone in the political system who's considering a campaign for president. Now, last year, the winning suggestion was Emily Post and her book, Courtesy. So you can't do that this year. I think we're in place and set to go. I would be very happy if the three of you carried this conversation by yourself. I don't think that I'm in any position to add a great deal, but I will jump in if I feel that we're teetering towards the edge. I guess my first question is what would be the impact if the Democrats won control of Congress and there indeed was an impeachment effort? What would that look and feel like? And what would the impact be on the people of America, 45% of whom, in a recent poll, feel that Trump has done a pretty good job? And Susan, why don't we start with you and march down this way?
Well, impeachment's a very serious thing. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that there are many people who don't feel that the last year has been a fair year. Nobody has concentrated on the nation's business particularly. We have heard nothing but stories and gossip and speculation on television every day. And I really fear for our country if we start this cycle of impeachment and then a kind of chaos that emerges from that. If you look at the other damaging results of the impeachment efforts in the past, this is a very, very serious thing. Now, I also take this seriously because I spent the lion's share of my career traveling to Russia and the former Soviet Union. I can barely stand what I hear on television because they never invite experts to come on and talk about Russia. The situation is way, way more complicated in all of this. And some of the things that come up on television are actually not only legal, but perfectly normal for people who are engaged in international affairs. Now, if there was any collusion, I mean real collusion, not just speculation about collusion, then this is a very, very serious thing. Very serious thing indeed. But I would ask all of my colleagues in Washington, I'm still living there, You know that old expression that Washington is Hollywood with unattractive people. Let me tell you, you know, they're looking more and more unattractive all the time. So this is a serious thing. It's a very, very tough place to be. I don't think we're looking at the nation's problems in the right way. We don't have a strategy for everybody in this country. An impeachment, a serious impeachment effort without unassailable causes behind that measure would cause untold damage, I think, to our country.
Well, up until about 4 months ago, I don't think I would have had any special insight into the mindset of the liberal base of the Democratic Party. But I joined as the token Republican for a liberal news outlet, new one called Crooked Media. I'm the only Republican that writes for them. And I moved about 5 minutes from the Berkeley border. So I think that I've gained a little bit of insight into the mindset of what the kind of grassroots left thinks right now. And let me tell you, there is going to be enormous pressure on the Democratic politicians if they take over the House to pursue some type of impeachment. Facts kind of be damned. I think that the 2020 candidates will feel enormous pressure to support that kind of impeachment because that's essentially what the rank and file Democrat base wants from them. So in that sense, the 2018 kind of House elections are very important because it will have, you know, it will result in almost inevitably that impact. At least they'll feel the pressure to do so. It's possible that they'd relent, but I wouldn't expect that. And as far as what the impact of that will be, I don't think I have much to add for what Susan said. We're a country that has, you know, become more and more deeply fissured, and trying to impeach a president that was duly elected, that I didn't support, but that was duly elected with probably at that time 35–40% approval, is only going to fissure it more.
Yeah, I agree with what Susan and Tim said. I'd add this sort of practical political observation. Let's assume the Democrats do take control of the House. They will do so only by winning swing districts. And the pressure that Tim talked about of the left of the Democratic Party that you got to be for this or you're out is going to require one of two things. It's either going to result in one of two things. It's either going to result in a lot of Democrats in seats where they require independent and Republican votes to get elected. This is not Nancy Pelosi's district or Barbara Lee's district, but this is a swing district in the Midwest. It will require them to walk the plank, and they will be gone after one term, regardless of what happens on the impeachment. Or it will result in the House of Representatives failing to approve an impeachment resolution supported by virtually all Democrats, opposed by every Republican and some Democrats, and the Democratic Party will be even more split going into 2020. This is not a, you know, I agree the most important thing, it's bad for the country, really bad for the country. But it will also be bad for the Democrats unless, as Tim says, there is clear and convincing evidence of an impeachable offense. And you saw a little bit of this play out inside the Republican Party in the failed impeachment of a guy who had sex with an intern in the hallway off of the Oval Office and then lied about it, costing him his law license. Even that Republicans overplayed and ended up finding themselves in 2000. Had we had a candidate who had stood up and said, you know, I'm going to make this an issue in the campaign, Bill Clinton's behavior, it would have been more damaging to the party, but instead George Bush refused assiduously to talk about it at all and simply said he would restore dignity and honor to the White House, thereby avoiding the issue. But it could have done damage to us in 2000. It did do damage to us. Could do a lot more damage to the Democrats in 2020.
Susan?
I'd just like to add here that standing back and looking at these various trends and exactly the kind of thing that Karl was talking about, it makes me feel like we're moving more and more towards a parliamentary system without any of the advantages of a parliamentary system. In other words, no opportunity to go to the country to reestablish credibility. The point being is that now today political parties are really only running races to benefit their bases. We don't have any leaders that I can see coming along who've got a strategy for the entire country on either side where we could actually make a choice and to live with that choice for 4 years. I'm a registered independent. This is a choice. I'm still waiting for both parties to talk to me in a way that I regret it. I'd love to join a party again. I'd love to go back to the Republican Party. I'm sympathetic to various elements of both parties. But do you know that 39% of the electorate in this country are independents, which is a larger group than both Republicans and Democrats. So this is really a sign when 39% of the electorate chooses not to be a member of either party. And so I think all kinds of things, it feels like it's a very fluid situation at the moment.
Tim, I'm a corporate spouse, and I'm living in California. What is your sense, as you suffer through Berkeley and Oakland, what is your sense of the politics in this state, and is there ever going to be a Republican Party here?
I think the biggest problem for Republicans in California right now is the national Republican brand, which is good, obviously, in many states around the country, as we have a record number of governors, but is not particularly good here in California, not to say the least. The problem is that since Arnold, there's not been a Republican in the state that could really separate themselves out from a national brand that's, culturally and demographically very, very different from what's happening here in the state of California. I'm very pessimistic by nature about what we have to come here in our politics for the next half decade or so with regards to most things. That said, I do feel like there is a lane in California for a Republican at some point in the mid-future to run essentially Trump without the ethno-nationalism kind of campaign. And I think that increasingly you see a frustration and a fracturing of the Democrats within the state over pocketbook issues. You're going to see a big gas tax fight coming up this year. The price of housing in California is insane. And so I think that if you sort of separated out some of the things that are unappealing about the national party, it's possible for a candidate to run here, but the problem is they'd have to have the money and the resources to do so, and they would have to be able to have the public presence like Arnold did because of his celebrity to be able to separate himself out. That's a kind of a magic white whale to a certain degree, but I do think it's possible.
Karl, I keep reading that the Republicans are going to lose Texas, that the demographics are such that in the next few years, Texas is going to be a Democratic state.
Yeah. Well, I keep hearing that. Thus far, the Democrats have not come up with a candidate for governor in the 2018 elections, and the filing deadline has passed. Now, look, I'm from Texas, and we're not really good on math, and it took me a while to figure this out, but I want you to see if you can follow me on this. Texas has a higher percentage of the population that is Latino than the national average. Texas has a higher percentage of the population that is African American than the national average. Texas has a higher percentage of the population that is Asian American than the national average. Thereby, I conclude that Texas has a smaller percentage of whites than the national average. And yet we are a deep red state. And the reason is because Republicans routinely get 40 to 45% of the Latino vote. Routinely. Wow. Our governor became the second governor elected with 50% of the Latino vote in his first election. He did so by running a television ad. And the television ad was emblematic of what else was going on in his campaign. The television ad featured his mother-in-law saying nice things about him. Latinos looked at it and said, wait a minute, his mother-in-law is one of us. He's married to one of us. And Anglos looked at it and said, that sumbitch could get his mother-in-law to say nice things about him. But when Bush ran for re-election as governor in 1998, as only the second Republican since 1872 to be governor of Texas, the majority of our statewide ticket were not white men. They were the minority. Women, Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans made up a majority of our statewide ticket. Now, as long as Texas Republicans keep that mindset of we're all in this together, our state speaks not merely to one group or another group, it speaks to all Texans, we'll be all right. And I keep hearing this. You know, the Democrats had a big thing a couple of years ago. Wendy Davis was the great hope, and they were going to demolish the Republican Party with this. And, you know, literally, anybody know who their candidate for U.S. Senate is? Anybody know who the Democratic candidate for governor is likely to be? They don't even have a full ticket statewide. And yet these are the same people who say, oh, just count on it. Demography is destiny. The more Latinos we get, the more we're going to be a Democratic state. Well, we're busily converting those Latinos and running them for office.
Susan?
I'm sorry, on what question?
Well, I thought you had something you wanted to throw in. What will be the major national issue in November of this year? Is it going to be the impeachment, or is there a compelling national issue that could be crystallized into the primary concern? Susan?
Yeah, no, I would say, you know, it's a question of what the issue is going to be versus what it should be. And what, because after all, we know that the media shapes much of what the campaign is going to offer the voters. What I think the issues ought to be is how this country is going to stay solvent. I mean, I don't think there's any question that we, unless something happens, we're going to see a ballooning of our budget deficit. And we see absolutely no effort, as far as I can make out, to actually think through a coherent strategy for our international obligations. And I say this is really important because for all of the discussions we've had here in the last couple of days, I've heard no discussion about the billions and billions of dollars we're spending overseas and what we're getting as a result of that. And I think those are the issues that we ought to have, or the larger issues, but I dare say that we will be down in the weeds about pocketbook issues well in advance of knowing what the results are of our new tax reform bill.
I honestly don't even think that the major issues in the media conversation will be about tax reform. I think that'll be long past. I do think that smartly, a lot of Republican candidates will be running positive ad campaigns about the effect of that, because there's a huge, right now, distance between the public perception on what the tax reform bill does and what it actually does in the negative, right? It's going to be much better for the pocketbooks of ordinary Americans than many realize at this point. But frankly, the major issues in the discussion in the lead up to November are going to be whatever the hell Donald Trump wants them to be. You know, Donald Trump has outsized control over what is happening in the news, but he does not have the self-control to be able to stick to a specific message. And so, you know, for me to sit here in January and say, well, in November we're going to be talking about tax reform or the budget is silly, because in October, you know, Donald Trump will, you know, likely send out a tweet about, you know, a senator's underwear or something to that effect, and that's what people are going to be talking about in October. And so I think that the whims of Donald Trump and the electorate's feelings about him are going to be the major issue, and likely secondary, depending on what happens over the next 2 months, will be immigration, because of there will either be a landmark deal on border security in DACA, or there won't be, and that will be the big outstanding issue facing the next Congress.
I'm a deficit hawk like Susan, but we're not going to be talking about that this fall because President Trump took that off the table in his campaign, saying he wasn't going to change Medicare or Social Security. I mean, we have a Medicare system in which the average two-person working couple put in $118,000 in Medicare taxes over the course of their life and take out $320,000 worth of benefits and leave the $200,000 plus on the credit card with their kid's name on it. So we're not going to be talking about that. What we ought to be talking about is what Tim touched on, the economy. I mean, think about it. Last fall, immigration was, in the exit polls, the fourth issue down at 13%. The economy was at 52%. And he's also right about the tax cuts. There's a new Harvard poll out. 20% believe they're going to get a tax cut in 2018. 30% think they will not get a tax cut. And 50% don't know. And what happens with that 50% who don't know, and if there's any decline in the 30% who don't think they're going to get a tax cut, is going to have a big impact on whether or not the Republicans have the landscape in which they can run and win. But he's absolutely right. I mean, it's a question of, are these candidates going to stay focused, and is the president going to stay out of their way? A couple weeks ago, he made a statement, or his people made a statement that they were going to, the president was looking forward to campaigning and spending most of 2018 out on the campaign trail for candidates. And I wrote a column in response to it saying, don't do it. Because the best thing he can do is try and be president and focus on the people's business. Don't be going, because when he gets in front of those crowds at those rallies, the self-control completely dissipates. That's when he says really weird things. And if he wants to have a Republican majority in the House and Senate and not have them nipping at him with a bunch of committees, even if they don't impeach him in the House, let me just tell you, I served 2 years in the White House with the Democratic House of Representatives, and it was like going to the proctologist every day without an anesthesiologist present.
Do you have any parallel attitude when you read the newspapers or watch television now?
Parallel to what?
Well, not having an anesthesiologist, I guess.
No, you know, look, there are a lot of really good things about the White House and a lot of really bad things about serving in the White House, but one of the best things is I can now look at this with a bemused, distant skepticism. So,
where do you get your news?
I read, in the morning I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and of course I lead off with the Wall Street Journal. And I didn't
realize you were such a consumer of the fake news media, Carl.
Yeah, exactly.
Fiction after fiction.
Exactly. I also get the guys who used to do the White House News Summary have graciously kept me on the list, so I get something like the White House News Summary. I read the newsletter from Politico and the political newsletters from Axis, and then I surf, as only a Norwegian with no balance whatsoever can surf.
Susan,
and whenever possible, I read whatever Tim Miller writes, but he hides it in very distant parts of the web. Miller, you need to do more promotion.
Tim, where do you get your
follow
news?
my Twitter feed if you dare.
I got 650,000 people on my Twitter feed. Who the hell are these people, and when are they going to get a life?
Great question.
Or start paying. Tim, what do you read? Or watch?
In the morning, I read the Axios newsletter like Carl, and I read Ben Dominich's newsletter. It's called The Transom. It's a conservative policy newsletter. I can't watch cable anymore. Honestly, I don't watch 1 minute of it. I guess I DVR when Carl's on. But besides that, I get the transcripts actually sent to me of Carl's when Carl's on, so I don't have to watch it. But cable is just terrible. And there's no Brett Baer's show is okay, and that's really it. There's nothing else on cable that's even watchable.
Fox News Sunday.
Fox News, well, that's not cable.
Dana Perino.
Dana's new show is good.
Yeah,
You're
Bill
right.
Hammer.
They're two good shows.
Bill
Okay,
Hammer.
we're starting to go. Now we're starting to go south a little bit. Don't tell Bill.
I wanted to test the limits.
Don't tell Bill. Now we're starting to go south.
Man, you're dead. I'm telling him. I'm telling him. I'm ratting you out.
That's all right. Me and Bill can go at it. But when I used to be on, it was okay. Besides that, I punish myself with Twitter most of the day and just take it to what I find to be interesting.
Well, I must be the only one.
Do we have a
here
psychiatrist in the house with an available time?
I'm going to need one.
I'm probably the only one here that reads not only the New York Times and the Washington Post, but I read an array of foreign press to see how our issues are being projected overseas. So this really gets to be a source of great deal of concern, the way they're talking about what's going on in our country. Actually, from my perspective, the biggest national security secret is that we can't govern ourselves very well anymore. It's a national security issue.
Where do you get your foreign news?
You know, I have a set of links, and I read, certainly scan through British papers. I read some in the Middle East. I also check out what they're saying in Russia and elsewhere.
Where do you get your Russian news?
Well, actually, the easiest thing first of all, the idea that Putin's got a lock on everything. He's certainly got a lock on the broadcast media. But if you want to read overheated editorials about how Putin should be kicked out of office and things like that, you'd want to be reading Moscow News, which is, the Moscow Times, which is actually in English. And they have a remarkably open debate about what Putin should or should not be doing in this campaign, and give a lot of space to the opposition. So, I check in with that largely to actually see how the developments in this country are being interpreted overseas.
Yeah. Not at the first of the day, but later on in the morning, I get a newsletter from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which has got pretty good links to a lot of what you're talking about there in both the international press and then columnists here. And then for economic news later in the morning, I get it early in the morning, but I save it until I got some time. E21, which is a great website out of New York that has some really good, and what's really good is they have a lot of economic where it's sort of like, here's the question of the day, and here's something from the left, and here's something from the right. Yeah. So you're able to get a little sense of how the debate is framing up.
Well, Karl, I read the newspapers, having worked on newspapers for quite some time, and I am just stunned by the absolute absence of fairness and balance. Mm-hmm. It is just alarming. I find a lot of facts, but all the facts are positioned in a way to represent what the newspaper's prevailing sentiment may be. Do you think journalism will ever go back to where it was, or is journalism now going to be a business of well-educated young people who are attempting to refashion the country, if not the world?
Yeah, I think we've gone through a brief golden moment of sort of journalism that was aimed at facts and information and explaining the events of the moment. It was preceded by a long period in which the press was highly partisan, obviously print, and then we had this brief moment where sometime maybe after World War II, the newspapers said our job is to explain without bias, and the three major networks sort of tried to do it without bias, but then that all began to break down, and now we're back to the wild, wild west. We're back to 1800, where we have 3,000 newspapers, and the Federalist papers reprint all the ugly editorials from other Federalist newspapers, and the Democratic Republican newspapers reprint all the ugly editorials from other Democratic Republican newsletters, and we only read the thing that sort of feeds our own sensibilities and watch the things that feed our own sensibilities, and we no longer have a sort of a common database of mostly accepted facts and explanations, and I think it's very problematic for democracy. It's one of the reasons why our trust in our institutions, the media is an all-time low, Congress is near an all-time low. We're back to where we were in 1974 with Watergate and the presidency. Supreme Court is still relatively high, but at the lowest level ever. About the only two institutions that have retained the trust of the American people are the military and law enforcement, and you can't have a democracy where that's the only thing you trust.
Tim, go ahead.
No, I just add to that. I think that there are a lot of negatives about our current media environment, including, most importantly, what Karl just talked about how we are all self-selecting our news and only getting news from people that confirm our prior beliefs. I will say, if this is a movement, though, towards a future where we put aside kind of the fake he said, she said of the past, the fake nonpartisanship of the past, I think that's a good thing. Journalists are humans who have points of view. And the idea that there was this golden age in the 80s, where Dan Rather was calling it like he saw it on CBS, is just not it's just not true, right? Journalists always had a more liberal, more elite point of view.
Yeah,
and
but it was more subtle, don't you think?
It was more subtle, but I think that I think that they were advancing their point of view, but trying to cover it up in this kind of faux sense of non-bias. And I think that moving more towards, this is particularly in political news. Obviously, there's an area for hard news where journalists have to report the facts. But I think moving to a place in political news where people acknowledge their biases on the front isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think that to your initial question about about the current news environment and its hostility to the president, I think that's true. Obviously, 100% of the journalists did not vote for President Trump. So there's an inherent...
But more than ever voted for a Republican candidate for president, and the biggest crowd ever for an inaugural.
Yeah, so there's an inherent bias, but because of Karl's joke, Karl's joke, though, brings up the fact that really the president only has himself to blame for this. I think that he could have the moral high ground about the bias against him if he was not constantly advancing anything from white lies to bald-faced lies, and constantly forcing the media to cover his kind of buffoonish tweets and behavior. And I think that if he was doing what I think a lot of his advisors wished he would do, and what Karl said he should do earlier, which is focus on governing the country, then they might have more of a high ground to complain about the press. So in short, it's kind of a pox on both their houses at this point, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that pox on both their houses. I think you're absolutely right, but I would say actually sitting in Washington, it looks like there's a complete and total feedback loop. In other words, the news media says he's terrible, but they've never seen more papers sold. They've never had so many hits on their blogs. They're making money hand over fist. If you look at the advertising that goes with political commentary these days, all those numbers are up. So they're making money on a president who loves to have attention. And so it's this big circular thing. I mean, my big concern about these campaigns is that this kind of thing is going to continue, and it's going to continue to alienate the public, because we have a lot of things that we have to get sorted out, and we're not going to have that conversation. We're probably going to be deprived of it in the midterms because we're still in the middle of this money-making drama.
Yeah.
And
it's going to be an interesting test of sort of the general theory that each presidential election is in some degree, particularly after 8 years, a reaction to the previous election.
right.
So we have 1960, JFK, we have I'm the young energetic guy as opposed to the senior Eisenhower administration, which is sort of, we need a new frontier, new generation of leadership. 1976, reaction to 1972 and Watergate, 1980, reaction to 1976. And maybe the question is going to be whether the next one says, we really want somebody who can govern and somebody who can unify and somebody who restores a certain sense of what we thought the presidency was about, or not.
Right.
And maybe call me an optimist, but my gut tells me the American people, as I travel around, I get a sense that people are getting worn out. Whether they like him or they don't like him, they're getting worn out.
Worn out.
And as people, and again, Republicans or Democrats. Obviously, I speak to more Republicans than I speak to Democrats, but I do have Democrat friends, and I do speak to Democratic audiences.
And
but
a Jewish
I get
lawyer.
What?
And a Jewish lawyer. You do have Democratic friends.
two Jewish lawyers, actually. But what does their religious affiliation have to do with that, Tim?
I was making a Kayla Moore joke.
Yeah, exactly. Where was I going with that? I think the other thing, though, is that I think both Republicans and Democrats, their attitude is, back to your phrase, pox on both their houses. Will you please get together and get something done. And act like adults?
Adults.
I'll take the pessimist contrary view to Karl. Karl's elected a president.
You're young.
So
you're supposed to be idealistic.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be the old-farted pessimistic.
Hopefully Karl's right, and his resume will speak to that. But I don't sense that the Democratic Party is looking for somebody who's going to bring comity and governance.
Oh no,
back.
I'm not suggesting Democrats. I'm suggesting ordinary people.
Well, they're going to have to nominate somebody, though.
Yeah.
And the next president will be either Donald Trump again or whoever the Democrats nominate. And I don't. There's not a lot of evidence right now that people are looking for somebody who's going to bring comity. An overwhelming number of people, not maybe the types of people that come to panels want comity, but I think that at least right now, if you look at society, the Democrats are looking for a fighter, and what I would suspect is that the Democrats will put up a couple of boring senators next time, and that they'll run the same. We'll get to relive the same history that we just ran in 2016, and there'll be some sort, either a socialist like Bernie or a celebrity or somebody who
I couldn't agree with you more. This is where I think the Democrats face a problem. If they nominate Joe Biden, Uncle Joe, as crazy as he is, stands a good chance of beating Trump.
Yeah.
If they nominate some fire-breathing 2020 hopeful who is part of the resistance, then that is That is going to give Donald Trump his second chance in a row to face the one Democrat he can defeat. And because, again, I agree with you. The Democratic Party's got this, you know, sort of the resistance is a virus, and that virus is causing them to be overheated and zombie-like. And if they were smart, they'd pick better fights and win a few of them and have an agenda, like this brilliant column in today's Wall Street Journal suggested, their absence of agenda. Yeah.
Did Brett write a column this morning?
Oh, I am hurt that you didn't read. You promised me you would read my column before you came here.
No, but I've got to say that I think you're right. I think on an earlier panel, somebody made the point that what the Democrats need is to become the opposition, not to become the resistance. And this is, I think, an excellent point. The other reason I've got a problem with this whole thing is I grew up in a military family, as you all know, and you know, in keeping with the great West Point tradition, there are only 4 answers to any question for a plebe entering West Point. That's yes, sir, no excuses, sir, and I don't know the answer to the question, sir, I'll get it for you, sir, okay? How about the no excuses? The thing that really bothers me about this going into impeachment territory, or as we talk and think about Russia, and this has been a gigantic political issue. It's a domestic issue now, less even than a foreign policy issue. Did anybody ever stand up and apologize for not properly preparing their organization against cyber attacks? No, it's always everybody else's fault. You know, we are a global superpower, and cyber capability is a capability the United States of America uses. It's a capability our allies use, and it turns out it's a capability that the Chinese and the Russians use too. So we have to take responsibility for protecting ourselves in that environment. I have not heard anybody say, I'm sorry, that my password was inadequate, that we didn't have cyber classes for people at our institution. And so if you want to know what worries me about this country and this continuing political discussion, is it's not going to be any good until we stand up and take responsibility for ourselves.
Susan, let me, as you scan the news from Russia, what is being presented to the Russian people about the collusion discussions and investigations and conflicts? What does Russia see of us?
Well, first of all, I think they're completely bewildered by what's going on. You do hear a lot about them saying that we have turned into a domestic political issue in the United States, which I'm sorry to say happens to be true. Now, I've got a lot of issues with that country and certainly with that leadership. But the truth is that Russia has become, in a sense, weaponized in our domestic political debate. Otherwise, we should be having a completely different discussion about Russia's behavior during this election. And I, for one, am sure that many other countries around the world tried to hack the servers of the DNC and the RNC. It's just that, you know, the Russians were effective in getting through those barriers. We are absolutely fooling ourselves if we think that what happened to us is in any way unique, because the United States has one of the biggest offensive cyber capabilities in the world, as we should have. And so we need to have a much more adult conversation about what's going on domestically and what interaction, where it interacts with our national security. We're not. And so I'm sure we're going to have a very exciting, very short-term, very tactical kind of set of elections coming up. But as an independent, and as a person who grew up in a household that was always talking about the long haul, I find it profoundly depressing.
Thank you. Karl?
Well, I agree with a lot of what she had to say, but I'm the silver lining guy. There's one good thing out of this. I never thought in my lifetime that the Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Hispanic Caucus would become virulently anti-Russian and support sanctions on Russian oligarchs and tyrants. And thank God there's been one positive thing to come from all this Russian business, and that is that the United States Congress is completely unified.
Yeah.
I think the vote in the Senate was 96-2 to install the sanctions on the Russians. So as an anti-communist who views Putin as a unreconstructed Romanist, monarchist, communist, I am delighted.
Well, he's a lot of things, but he's not a communist, I'll tell you that.
I like thinking of him as such because he was a KGB agent.
No, listen, I think there's no question that a unified approach by the United States government about this issue is absolutely appropriate.
And look, the Senate Intelligence Committee, I hope, and my sense is, Burr and Warner are not going to simply have a report on the Russian attempts to influence the election, but I think they're going to have a concrete series of recommendations, and the fact that they have conducted their investigation in a way that has not been highly partisan, has not been polarizing, is going to give them credibility to make those suggestions to the Senate, and I would suspect if it comes roaring out of the Senate with strong numbers, there is no way the House is not going to adopt those same kind of recommendations. So my hope is, and I've had a conversation with a couple of members of that committee who are sort of vaguely implying, yes, we're going to do that.
Can I just say briefly, since I'm Mr. Raincloud here on Carl's optimism, I agree Senator Burr has been fantastic, and Senator Warner has been fantastic. I'm discouraged by what I expect will be the president's response to it, and what a lot, and unfortunately in the conservative media, not Karl, of course, are going to say about this. And I think that if you look at polls right now about what Republican voters think, over half of them still don't even think that Russia did this, right? That's deeply concerning. And if this issue, if this threat of cyber, whether it's Russia or, like you said, other countries, becomes a partisan football, where, it helped my party this time, so I'm not going to care about it, I'm going to switch sides on it, that is very dangerous. And there are a lot of other ways that Russia and China and other countries are going to be able to impact our political system if we do not take a united front on this. And I think it's really incumbent on the president and conservative leaders, when the Burr-Warner report comes out, to say this is serious and we need to resolve it. Otherwise, I don't know. I think that we might just be in for a redux in a few years. Yeah,
well, I just want to follow that up to make my position very clear. I really do support the Mueller probe. I think we need to get that information from him as soon as possible. It's a very, very serious thing. Any suggestion of collusion, and the American people deserve to know about that. And I'm also very much in favor of having a united front so that this country stands for something. I've got no problem with sanctions and other things, though I think we have to be realistic about how effective sanctions are going to be. Having said that, we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And that means that we should not only do all of those things, but we should also understand that cyber activity is the new frontier. And this is a very, very serious thing, and for all of us to take it casually, or to even act like victims here, only creates a barrier between ourselves and taking responsibility for our own futures by getting educated about this and making sure we take measures.
Karl?
I agree with that, and I think that one of the things, my disappointments was, we did have one set of excuses for the behavior of the Russians and our response to it, and that is when the previous administration sent out spokesmen to basically say, well, we didn't want to make it a big public issue because we were afraid of getting involved in the campaign, and besides that, President Obama spoke harshly to Vladimir Putin in the summer. Well, not good enough. Yeah. And Vladimir Putin likes being harshly spoken to by Barack Obama. Makes him feel good. So we've got a lot to do in that regard. And we have an example, and I credit the Obama administration with this. When we needed to, and when they came after us in cyber from Iran, we went back at them with cyber in Iran, and the message was, you mess around with us, and there's going to be a price that you're going to pay, and your price is going to be higher than any price that you've exacted from us. We should have done the same with the Russians.
Okay. Okay, let's hear your book recommendations, starting with you, Susan.
Well, you probably won't be surprised to hear me suggest A Strategy for the Long Haul by Patrick Doherty and Mick Mickleby. Mickleby wrote a strategic approach for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and this book is an excellent way of thinking about how to shape the future.
Tim?
On brand for my depressing contribution to today's panel. The saddest book I've read in the last year is called A Little Life. It was beautiful and sad. You all should read it. With regards to 2020, I'd read Amusing Myself to Death by Neil Postman.
No title yet for this book, but there's going to be a book on presidential decision-making in March of 2019, focused on 6 big presidential decisions and trying to divine whether there are successful habits of successful decision-making by presidents.
Are you allowed to identify the author of this important book? Whoa! Well,
and the first chapter is entitled "Drawing in the Money of the World."
Okay, we're down to a few seconds. Thank you, you were great to the trio. It was just marvelous. And thank you, Jamie, for putting this crowd together.
By the